Immediate right by Mr. Brian Dames, who's the CEO of African Rainbow Energy and Power. We have Phuti Mahanyele, who's the CEO of Sigma Capital. And we're joined by Rakesh Wahi, who is chairman of CMA Investment Holdings. Thank you very much for your time. Where should we start today? The Trump election, administration, the president-elect? We have to. So let me throw this to you, Brian. And I suppose this is one of the instances where you don't have to be worried that you were on the wrong side of the equation, unless you knew something that everybody else globally appeared not to have been aware of.
No, I don't. And maybe as shocked as Trump himself and most Americans. But I think, let me first start off. I mean, we're here with Rakesh's book launch. So as my dear friend, I have to congratulate him on this. And hopefully one day we'll follow suit and write down our own thoughts. So reflecting on what has happened, I think it is evident to something that has actually started through the Arab Spring. And I remember talking and I was in a previous job, and the global CEO of McKinsey came to talk to me, and it was at the time that the Arab Spring was happening, and we were talking about it. And I think it is clear that societies, businesses, markets are shaped by society. So if you're running a business, you must be well in tune with what is happening. Leaders don't change companies, I think and countries. I think to a great extent, societies do that. We are a lot more connected. People sometimes don't know what they want. So you have a government, you then change the government, you have another government, and you keep on protesting. So it is and leaders are also everywhere, in civil society, in the community, in trade unions, and so people has to be attuned to what's really happening. And there's this phrase of we want change. That is correct. But what is the change that we want? And so people that are attuned to that then rises. And that is what we've seen through the Arab Spring. That's what we've seen through many parts of Europe. And I guess that's what we've seen now in the US. And I think going forward, it's very true and that's why I think markets and companies and pollsters get it wrong. Because we use the old recipe, and yet the world has fundamentally shifted.
Well, the digital environment definitely called this one. So maybe those are the new pollsters of the future. But Phuti, in a recent conversation that we had with Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan, he referred to his recent trips to the G20 and to the IMF. And he alluded to this huge disconnect between the global elite and civil society, and that everybody was grappling with this problem, and inclusive growth being the prevailing theme. Yeah. Could you weigh in? I know you've also just spent some time in Washington.
Yeah. Well, I think, firstly, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's wonderful to be here and to be talking about the book that Rakesh Wahi has written. I think, it's a very important point that you raise. And certainly when one just looks back, and you think back to, the fact that I certainly did not believe that we would get to this point where we'd be talking about President Trump, So it really took me by quite a shock surprise myself. And I think when you go back and you look at just the fundamentals around the people, I certainly would have thought that when you look at the administration of the Obama presidency, that there's been quite a significant shift economically. But clearly, people themselves had a number of other issues that, certainly for us as non-citizens, we're not aware of. But, what it certainly has drawn to me is just the fact of just how important it is to be linked to what people's thoughts are, and to really have a clear understanding of what is going on amongst the people every day. And I guess if one were to look just around us, it's issues around education, employment, all of those opportunities that people are seeking. Because at the end of the day, it's about people being able to get opportunities. When you read, Rakesh's book, and you see, how he was able to come from the military and create a business. It is about opportunity, being able to have a skill set and having the opportunity to realize something. And I think for many young people in our society, for instance, that is what they're crying for. They're saying, can we have an opportunity to realize, some of the ambitions or thoughts that we have? And so I think certainly the US has been a lesson for the rest of us. But what I hope is that, for leaders politically and, in other spheres, in business as well, that we are able to really deal with this in a significant manner.
Rakesh, there's a lot of debate, particularly when it comes to emerging markets and the impact that a Trump administration will have for emerging markets. Obviously, emerging markets being your playground, we know well, both in the education space and in the media space. Have you had time to digest the potential impact of the new leader of the free world on the space that you are well attuned to?
Well, thank you very much, Bron, and thanks, Brian and Phuti. I think I would echo what Phuti just said and perhaps what Brian said. The Trump victory has come as a surprise. And if you look at the genesis of this, if you look back in 2008, there was a serious issue in the US. It was a global issue. The economy revived from there. And there's not been a great opportunity to talk about successes, because by the time they stabilized the economy and got to where they are, people are still in a state of poverty, and there's unemployment. There are a lot of macroeconomic factors that still haven't been addressed. So when this guy comes there and starts talking about things which are not relevant, he talks about change that he has no idea about, people start expecting something different. They're expecting something to happen that they haven't seen happening before. And perhaps Brian talked about societies bringing about this change. So I think a lot of what he's created is perception. And it's not necessary that everything that he has said is what he's going to be able to achieve. Things like Obamacare and, taking 20 million people out from healthcare. These are not things that you can repeal overnight. But people don't really understand that. And sometimes you wonder how educated people can't see through some of these promises. But having said all of that, and accepting the fact that there is a mandate now that he has, I think it'll only be fair to give him an opportunity. Every leader has to be given a chance to succeed. So I see it as perhaps an era of change in the US. Part of what he talked about was that you would have pretty much the same of what has been happening for the last 30 years with Hillary coming. Perhaps people bought into that. And they said change is going to be for the better. And so I think we should first and foremost give him an opportunity to try and see what he can do differently, if he can.
So right now you're not making a call on his impact on emerging markets?
I think there's going to be an initial impact on emerging markets where people are going to be worried. So when you look around some of the things he's been talking about, in terms of his trade, policies and how he's going to deal with immigration issues, it's going to have some fear across the board. The markets have reacted to that. But I don't believe that that is something that is going to stay in the medium term. Things will change. You also got to remember that America has very strong institutions. These institutions are not going to allow anybody to do something exceptional. They have checks and balances through which they will be able to prevent things. But if he becomes as trigger happy as he's been showing himself to be, then there would be reason for concern. But I think in the immediate, I don't believe that you're going to see something that you should be overly concerned about.
Brian, yes, you're operating across Africa.
No, I just want to build on what Rakesh is saying and talk about emerging market and leadership. And so if we go on the premise that societies change through what the needs of society is in different countries and in different places, then leadership in emerging markets needs to be bold and courageous about what they want to create independent of what happens in the US. Yes, the world is linked, and yes, there's global trade. But where would you invest? Where there are clear fundamentals. What are those? If you have population growth, if you have a market, if you have the resources, if you have a policy framework that is stable, predictable, and if you have no corruption, and you have credible leadership that understands and closes the gap around the haves and the have-nots, then those are the fundamentals for making investment. And many of those components exist in emerging markets.
Let's talk about Africa, though. Would you think it's fair to say that all of those criteria are widely found across the African continent?
Not all of them. So not all of them. So the question is, how does leadership that have a whole bunch of this deals particularly with the issues of governance? How do you then don't become big to be in the way or big to steal? How do you become big to enable those things that you have to grow? And everybody, your economies to grow, civil society to grow. I believe the world will be shaped by business, by civil society, and actually local governments.
Phuti, I don't want to ignore South Africa, because I think it's important that we then move to the changes that have happened in the US to South Africa, and currently what is afoot in the country.
Yeah.
There's a lot of political noise, and that's a very polite way to state what everyone knows.
Yeah.
Let's get you to give us a sense of how you think the dynamic will change from a leadership perspective in South Africa. I'm not talking here about changes in individuals, but if we look at the change that has been forced in the United States, a similar situation could unveil in South Africa.
Yeah, I guess the previous elections that we had were quite an indication of a change. I mean, the fact that we have municipalities, that are now being led, by the DA, that was people speaking out,
Are you expecting more of the same?
Obviously, I don't know anything about politics. I'm not in that world, but I would imagine that there would definitely, I would expect that there would be a change of form. I'm not saying that this will not be an ANC-controlled government, but I would expect that there would have to be a fundamental change, because I think South Africans have spoken. It's come to a point where it's no longer, last year we had students marching. This year we've had students and business people also coming out. I mean, it's to a point where it will definitely see a change. The issue is what change, whether we will be seeing ourselves being led by a different political party, or perhaps we will still have the same party, but there'll have to be a fundamental change within that party. But at the end of the day, what I like is that South Africans are coming out and saying that this is what is not working for us, and this is the change that we want to see. What has saddened me is seeing young people being imprisoned. These are young people who are seeking an education so that they can make a difference in society. We have millions of young people who are not seeking an education, not because they don't want to, but because they don't have access to it. But now we have those that are, and we treat them like they're criminals. I mean,
So one thing we can be sure of is change is on the cards, and
Absolutely.
not necessarily only in South Africa, but in economies globally. And Rakesh, the pertinent question for you, of course, is as an investor in emerging markets, how does the leadership aspect impact your decision to invest and how deep you invest in an economy?
Well, I think it's a very critical aspect. If you look at the first thing that you look at when you go into a country is political stability, and you look at the institutions of government and see how sturdy those are. So it's an important aspect of what you consider. You expect a level playing field in any market that you go into. So you expect that policies would be consistent. that government would, irrespective of the political environment, policies would be carried forward in a similar manner. Now, these are some areas where there are some historic problems, particularly in South Africa. And I want to actually go back to the discussion that Phuti was having. And I want to draw a parallel with India. We emerged under very similar conditions in 1947. And we were also governed by one party, which was the Indian National Congress. It took 70 years for the political system in India to completely fragment, where the Congress party has less than 8% in our parliament today. It's not even called a viable opposition anymore. Now, if you look at the ANC, it's very similar. You are not really in a traditional democracy. While we say we are in a democracy, you're not really in a democracy because you're still a single party government. You do have the DA and other minorities, but I think the evolution of the political system in South Africa is essential to the future of this country. The accountability of government only comes when you have multi-parties asking each other questions, which is what you've seen in the last municipal elections, when DA has now won various municipal elections and they're asking questions. So these checks and balances have to come about to bring about proper change. The second area where I think we've missed a point in South Africa is in institutions. Post-94, the complete shift took place to the administration with black executives. A lot of them didn't have the benefit of a formal education. And I think the government needs to invest in that because there's a lot of difference between administrating and politically governing a country than having the skills to do it. And if you don't set up strong institutions, you will never be able to protect the policies that I'm talking about. So as an investor, what I see is not just the politicians and what they're saying. I also look at what are the institutions under that. What are the underlying governance mechanisms that actually make sure that these projects are sustainable over long periods of time. Our investments are not short term. We don't come here to put money today and take it out tomorrow. I'm going to be here, we've been here 10 years, and we're going to invest for the next 25 years. So if I am going to be putting my money into markets, I got to make sure that the institutions outlive people.
Despite the bleak outlook for economic growth in South Africa, the political noise that we've alluded to repeatedly in the conversation to this point, the strength of our institutions does stand out. On the strength of our institutions, would African Rainbow Energy and Power continue to invest heavily in South Africa?
Yes, and many others are doing that. And particularly also the strength of our legal system around honoring legal agreements and contracts. And I think we have a huge, huge advantage as a country, and we should never put that at risk and really build on that to take South Africa to new heights. And yes, you're right, and that's what you look for in different jurisdictions. And so we remain optimistic not only about South Africa, but also about the rest of the African continent.
At this point, I'd like to punctuate the conversation. We've covered, in short, the US and South Africa. Are there any questions from the audience at this point on those two topics? Because I'm going to move on now to a broader discussion about leadership, about business leadership, as I said in the initial stages of the conversation, and also what kind of leadership has inspired the likes of our three panelists. So I'm opening to this point any further discussion on the US or on South Africa. I take it that we've covered our ground well on that front. Monique and Chris.
I was going to say, Brian, you would know about this one. Do you not fear for this power Africa thing now that President Barack Obama was pushing for this continent?
Yeah, and I asked them. I actually asked them as of like 2 weeks ago. And they assured me that they have, similar to the AGOA part, they have put legislation in place to ensure that it would maintain and have a life after he leaves. And he had a unique vision that he's been absolutely correct on. I think that the one would have wanted to see a great sense of acceleration, so that it's more than just have to be protected by legislation, that on the ground, in the continent, it's been very effective, and it's kind of like a pull instead of a push. But yes, you're correct. That is one of the things that I particularly would pay careful attention to, whether or not it will, because it's all part of the USAID type work.
Monique?
I was just wondering if the panel had any thoughts on why Clinton, as a leader, did not win the American elections.
Well, this is going to be analysed for years and years to come. So perhaps just your overnight thoughts. And Phuti, let me throw it to you.
Well, clearly, I think the one thing that's come out is the fact that there hadn't been enough of a focus on issues that were affecting the American citizens. What I've read is the fact that it appears that there wasn't enough of a focus on what the everyday person was experiencing. Honestly, I think as an outsider, I don't understand it, because my understanding was that economically things had been improved quite substantially. But so I'm still trying to understand it myself, but I know a lot.
Along with the rest of the world, trying to understand.
So let me give you my theory, and it's really speculation. I've got no knowledge and not an expert at all. I mean, I don't know a lot about, I know a little about quite a lot of things. So my theory, if I go back to what I said around societies, I think people throughout the world today like small versus big. They like things close to them, communities. I want my own power supply. And it happens throughout everything. Telephones, cell phones, and no big government, no big institution, no big companies. And people has become disillusioned with the system, and slowly but surely, throughout the world, through the fact that people are connected, that is changing. And so if you're not attuned to that, you would miss it, like what has just happened.
Rakesh, you also wanted to come here.
I'm not going to duplicate any of the issues. I think there's a fundamental view that I have on this. And I think while America has been an economy and a country that has talked a lot about equality, I do not believe that they're ready for a woman president. And I think it's a major aspect that has driven this election. I do not believe that they are ready for a woman president. Otherwise, things would have been very different. So, the other aspect that played very negatively against her were this entire email scandal and whatever else that played out, particularly what happened 10 days before the elections. And I think when people go to vote, they don't look at the past, they don't look at anything else, they look at what is immediately being put out in there. And it was more an impulsive action on the part of a lot of people. So I think a lot played against her at the end, but I wouldn't be surprised if the gender issue has played an important role in this election as well.
Sid?
So, not really a question, it's more of an observation building on the subject matters in US elections, but if you look at the Scottish referendum or the Brexit issue and then the US elections, all of the polls indicated that the opposite would happen. So does this mean if you had to put your money somewhere, you should actually do the opposite of what the polls say?
And we've had two examples of this now, of course. Brexit, is it 3 out of 3?
Yeah.
The referendum, the Brexit, and
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's because the models are based on what you've known for many
On
years.
predictability, I think.
Absolutely.
And so that has fundamentally changed.
Yeah.
And so it's like running a business. If you run a business or a country in a certain way, this has changed. You're totally disconnected with reality.
Yeah.
I think, the word black swan comes to mind all the time now because everything is becoming exceptional.
Yeah. I mean, for me, what has been amazing is the fact that not only has he won, but he's got Congress, which is Republican. I mean, the House, it's just, it's unbelievable, the scale of it. And I find it hard to understand it, but we will, I'm sure.
It actually may work better.
Yeah.
It may
Well,
actually
in
work
terms of
better for the
pushing-
US.
Well, it stands to be seen. And let me just throw out there that everyone was anticipating a dramatic crash of the markets. I mean, if you read many of the doomsayers, they were saying that if a Trump administration came to fruition, we would see 10 to 15% sell-off in the markets. And we braced ourselves as a newsroom Markets closed higher, yesterday.
But I guess also people do have a need to have a level of optimism. You know, at a time when here in South Africa everybody was talking about a credit downgrade. I was talking to international investors who were looking at continuing and putting more capital into South Africa. And they were saying, can you help us to put a strong position forward to our investment committees, so that we don't have to take money out? So at the end of the day, people need to be able to have places where they can invest their capital and all of that. And if we are to see a way forward, we need to find the positive aspects and build on them. I mean, I thought that, for instance, Hillary Clinton's response yesterday, where she indicated that she had actually offered to, help, President-elect Trump in his new government and, all of that. I thought it was actually incredible. I mean, the whole succession was unbelievable.
Unifying rather than dividing.
Absolutely.
I want to come to this leadership aspect now. Rakesh, it is a key underpin to your book, Be a Lion. How do you define leadership?
I guess, it's a very complex subject. It's been discussed all over the world, and it, obviously is a subject which is part of every management discussion. But if you go to the heart of it, as a leader, it doesn't matter whether you're leading a country or a business, whether you're leading else, or as you pointed out in the beginning, a household. I think it's first and foremost understanding very clearly what your objectives are. So it's, you need to know where you want to be, where you want to take your business or, your family or whatever else it is. So defining your goals for a leader is the first and foremost issue. Once you have that, then it's about implementing it. And implementation is where most people fail. Most businesses fail, most other things fail because you have a good talk, but you don't have the means to actually fulfill that. So it's about then aggregating the resources to make sure that you get to that objective. The core of all resources is people. So how do you find the right people? How do you motivate them? And how do you take them with you? And in my book, I've talked a lot about interdependence. How do you create this interdependence with people? Because relationships that don't have interdependence over time fail. They cannot, except if it's by blood. You can forgive each other when you're related to each other. But you will never forgive anybody who's not interdependent and who makes mistakes again and again on values. And then it's about building trust. How do you build that trust between people so that you have consistent actions over a period of time, that people know that this is how this man's going to behave when things are going well and when things are not going well. So it's about, the core of it is motivating people and leading them to the final objective that you've set out.
Well, let's build on that now. Interdependence and trust. Brian, you can take this further for me.
Yeah, I was privileged to lead quite a large organization of about 40,000 people, and
I'm understanding that this organization is going to remain nameless throughout our conversation. I was just wondering.
Because organizations is made up of people, and at any one time there was another 40,000 that you had oversight, so about 80,000 people. And the question is, now how do you deal with all of this? And I want to just pick on what Rakesh said. I've always had a strong belief that, leadership is about now your ability to firstly understand yourself. It's quite an important issue. How you work, how you think, who you are, and how do you relate with the next level, which is the people around you, and then how do you capture people's energy. Now, let me give you an example. If you watch people watching soccer, or in the case of India, cricket, or rugby, and you see this massive amount of passion that people have on a Sunday or Saturday. So the trick for leadership is how do you have a person like that, but Monday when they come to work, they're totally different. So the question of the quality of leadership is what is the environment you create within an organization to be able to capture people's energy and passion. And those values that Rakesh talked about are then hugely important. You need to know yourself. You need to know the value system, because people will do what you do. They don't do what you say. And that is crucially important. And so you need to know yourself. You need to know your value system. And that creates those interdependencies. So you can recruit, I've always believed that the person that you recruit is, you can teach everybody, you can send people to university, train them up in any skill, but you can't change their attitude. And so that is a value system that you look for when you look for people.
Let me come in here. The environment that you need to create as a leader, the nameless organization that employed so many thousands of people, what kind of environment were you trying to create?
No, you needed to be absolutely clear around things such as the value system: honesty, integrity, respect in your engagements, the customer comes first, a sense of absolute transparency. In today's world, there's no such thing as secrets. If you run your company as if it's a secret, you're going to keep the secret. There's no such thing. You can't keep the email secret. You can't keep your videotape making comments on women secret. And so if you accept that, you then are actually relieved in making sure you deal with things transparently, good and bad. But people then see you quite honest in your engagement.
Interdependence, trust, we're talking about
Yeah,
honesty,
yeah.
respect,
Yeah.
integrity.
Yeah. So I've had the fortune of seeing that, and I think that certainly one great experience was in the 11 years that I spent at Shanduka, where we started a business. And when we started the business, I joined when they were just 2 years old. It was, and still lots of ideas, and there was possibility than there was actual net asset value. And so there was a significant dependence on the abilities of people to be able to create value. And also a significant dependence on the ability of people to bring their best values of themselves as people into the business. And what we saw was a transition. So as the business was growing in net asset value, people were starting to decide, do I actually belong here? Because an environment changes over time. And so people were starting to make decisions around that. But it's so important to have people around you that you can have that high level of interdependence on, and people that you can trust. In my own organization, which I started this year, I've seen that as well, because you hire people on based on the CV and few discussions that you've had, but what really comes out is who the people really are, and so having that interdependence is something that is really crucial.
Brian brought into the discussion a really important point, in that people will do what you do rather than what you say. Rakesh?
Well, I think leading from the front is the most important part of any leadership, and you've got to be there. When I started my career in the military, and the first thing my first boss taught me, and he was hard on me for this, was that if there is a soldier anywhere, you got to be there. So if there's any activity going on, doesn't matter what it is, how big or small, you got to be there. And these are values over time that I've tried to instill in the business as well. If you have people in the studios who are working on a weekend, going there to make sure that they're eating their food, there's not much you can do to help them execute their task. What you got to do is make sure that they're comfortable, that they don't require anything. If they're at the front line of it, you provide them the necessary tools. So I think leading from the front is one of the most exceptional and critical aspects of being a good leader.
But it's also, like Rakesh said, what do you do in that situation? And he has many, and maybe that's why we ended up playing golf together and ended up being good friends. But it's that value system. I used to travel the country quite often, see people. But I used to make a point of dishing up for people at lunch.
Physically dishing up.
Physically dishing up for them. And so they were all surprised. But what it says to you is people then relate to you as a person. as to making yourself subservient. And that's hugely important. And this thing about value system, I've always believed, doesn't mean you get an interdependence. It doesn't mean you must get the same people. You actually have to understand yourself to get people around you that are totally different from you. That's, if you get everybody that's exactly the same as you, you're going to have a problem. Because you want that interdependence, but also a great sense of, keeping checks and balances. Yeah.
Phuti, this is a topic that you are well versed in, and I know you ask the question all the time, and that comes obviously to the gender equation and females in leadership.
Yeah.
Give us your sense of what you are seeing with those people that you are mentoring, and I'm talking specifically about young women.
Yeah.
Will the face of leadership change in South Africa, given the investments that people like you are making when it comes to young women?
Yeah. It comes back to opportunities. For us to have been able to grow in our careers, it came because of opportunities that were there. And also because of us being readily also available to take up those opportunities. When you look at universities today, we know that we have young women who are the ones who are really the leaders in terms of numbers. When you look at people that are graduating from universities and all of that, we have many young women that are graduating out of university. And when you look at the levels, the junior levels in many corporations, we have many young women there. But it's at the senior level that we don't see the young women. And so it really will come to us being able to create the opportunities. Because when you talk to young people, they want to be able to see themselves grow. But the spaces are not being created. When you look at corporates, we still have corporates today that are listed where you don't have a female person on a board, where you don't have a female person on an exco team. This is something that continues, and we cannot continue to have the same discussion. At the end of the day, it is about being able to create a way forward for our businesses. And so if we are to do that, we need to be able to draw on the skills that are readily available to push those businesses forward. And so if we are saying that it's just the male gender that can do that, then clearly we're not presenting ourselves in the best way possible.
Rakesh is well qualified to weigh in at this point.
Yeah.
You have appointed numerous female leaders in your organizations.
Yeah. Well, I think I have a belief that there has to be respect for women in general as part of society, and it all emerges from there. You will find that if women have an appropriate positioning within the family structure, within the social structure, you'll find that the respect for them in the workplace as well as the opportunities will be afforded to them. So there's a lot of lip service that is being given to this particular issue on gender equality. People talk a lot about it because it's a very nice thing to say. But implementing it is a very different thing. I think there is, the males generally feel threatened, to have a woman boss. You have all kinds of nuances. If you look at countries that are a little more backward in this particular issue, you'll find that there is no gender equality. A lot of Middle Eastern countries still live in the Stone Ages when it comes to gender equality. I've been personally a great advocate of equal positioning in the workplace. I think that we're missing 50% of the potential that can be harnessed if we don't allow women to come up. And we've put our money where our mouth is in the organization. More than 50% of the women who work in our organizations are women. In South Africa, over 50% of our exco are women. We have very strong representation in our boards, and we make sure that they've got a voice that is similar to anybody else. So I think you've got to get past thinking that this is a woman or a man. I think you've got to see what they bring to the table and make sure that they are providing that to the fullest. And I think that works. So even when I was setting up Forbes Woman Africa as a magazine, there was a resistance from everybody that, why set up another magazine? And the reason I did that was because there's so many stories of entrepreneurship on the continent. And if we had just allowed it to be written in Forbes Africa, these stories about women would never have come to the fore. Because there are thousands of women making a difference in different fields, and these are not being talked about. And we've finally given a platform that allows a lot of women in different parts of Africa today to actually be showcased. And the magazine's doing phenomenally well. So when we started out, people had a lot of doubts about the success of it. But we said, talk about influence, don't talk about wealth. Talk about the influence that women make in the workplace, in social development, and it's all happening now.
Brian, the world is changing so dramatically. At the beginning of the conversation, we spoke about the pollsters getting it wrong, but the social media environment getting it right. Leadership has to change to cater for that changing environment globally, and it's not just digital forces. It's also youth coming to the fore. And we know the stat well that Africa is heading for the youngest workforce globally. How does leadership cater for that young injection?
Yeah, it's again understanding, the issue around gender or youth. It's about what are the fundamentals for your business, where you run a government, who are most of your voters. When you run a business, who are most of your customers, it actually makes a decision. So unless you understand that, you kind of like would miss your business.
But we're saying youth is actually prevailing across the board here.
So crucially important that leadership in all spheres, including business, really understand the needs of young people today. They need to be, connected. So we grew up in old organizations. Again, organization remained nameless. You have a 90-year organization, you have strict policies that says you will not have access to the internet. And you will do this with the telephones, etc., etc. Now, that's great. But what you miss is that young people today have to be connected. Now, if suddenly your workforce has got all these young, bright engineers, and you have these old policies applied to them, you totally miss. And so you need to engage with them. You need to understand that. You need to invest in understanding those needs. And you also, as a leader, need to invest in understanding the future of your industry and society and how things change. And leaders that normally are not equipped lead to their companies, their governments, their departments failing.
Education, media, two industries that are being hard hit by digital transformation. How does that impact your decision on leadership in those organizations?
Before I address that, Brian, I'd like to, just comment on what Brian was talking about. And I think engagement with youth is the most critical part of any leader today. We are living in a world of disruption. And when I look at my knowledge, it's limited. I call myself a dinosaur. My children once said that your iPad is your biggest coaster. And I think, there are so many things you don't understand. You have young people sitting in your boardroom making notes on their cell phones. Now, you could take it as a mark of disrespect, and I did react to it many times. I've taken, cell phones from my son, my nephew, my children in the boardroom and thrown it in the dustbin saying that, what are you doing?
It's quite a dramatic action. I'm not sure you should be saying that on a public platform.
But these things happened. And the reality is that they are fact-checking everything you say. So, when our parents, and Brian was talking about history, when our parents said something, we said, this is the gospel of truth. The Father has spoken. It's no longer true. They actually find 20 things wrong in what you're saying. So you got to actually be very careful in what you're saying to the youth of today. And the second aspect of it is learn from them. If the future constituencies are going to be the youth, as you rightly identified, that the future in Africa is this billion people that are going to come, you have to make sure that you integrate their thinking, their consumption habits into everything you do. So therefore, you've got to learn from them. And what we've done in the organization, which is perhaps unique in many ways, is created touch points where you've created shadow boards with young people. You actually bring them into your decision making. We had a young leaders program, which we ran a few years ago at the ABN Group. And the authority I gave every person that qualified from the YLP was that you can question any decision that we make as senior management, you can come and ask us why we did something. And the reason is because they are the best, kind of reality check on what you're doing. Finally, another important aspect of harnessing youth is reverse mentorship. Now, this is something that very few leaders do. Sit down in a room and bring in all the young people and tell them, what am I doing wrong? We are in this great habit of telling
Besides
everybody.
throwing everyone's cell phones
Exactly.
in the dustbin. I hope they came back hard.
They've never forgiven me for it. but I think, the key issue is that we as leaders end up thinking that we're sitting in ivory towers. And when you're doing your reviews and you're doing your analysis, you tend to talk to people and tell them, look, you should be doing this. But what about introspecting a little bit and saying, what the hell am I doing wrong? And let somebody from down there, these youth who are sitting there in their 20s, turn around and tell you, look, this is what you should be doing. And such good things have come out. Part of what Brian talked about earlier was this aspect of transparency. We've had this issue within the organization many times when decisions have been made, and then there are rumors that start in the company, and people wonder what's going on. And when we got this feedback, we started correcting it. The MD started going around by department, talking about the issues that we were being faced with. And you suddenly find that it starts clearing the space up. It also motivates people that, they have a voice. Just because they're young doesn't mean that they don't have a mind of their own.
I want to bring you back to the question that I asked, which actually is linked to youth, and that is that you operate in two industries that are really impacted by technology and the digital environment. And if you don't embrace digital and the youth, because the two go hand in hand, then both of those businesses could cease to exist.
The first thing that I did was recognizing my shortcomings. I handed over the future to my son. When he came back from university, and this is not because he wasn't capable, I saw that, he had a very strong understanding of technology. And he digitized the complete aspect of our media business. And that transition was important. So I think, it's disruption is a way of the future. The core of the business is not going to change. So if you look at media or television, content creation is going to remain a very important aspect of what we do because people are going to be hungry for information. How it is received is what is evolving. How do you make sure that that works? The young generation consume everything on their handheld devices today. So how do you make sure that you're geared up for that? So that's what you hand over to the future leaders and actually let them direct it. And you provide them the overall governance and you provide them, the experience. But leave it to them because they're the ones who are going to be able to drive this for the future. In education, there's a huge focus on innovation. And our model has been bringing global brands into emerging markets. So we brought some of the best university brands into Africa. We got Lancaster University in Ghana. We're now partnering with the University of Aberdeen in Rwanda. And the universities ask me a lot of questions because they have a lot of fears about bringing their brands into emerging economies. So we do the whole due diligence and everything. But the only question I ask the vice chancellors is, where do you see your business 30 years from today? And if they cannot give me an answer, and we don't have crystal balls, but if they cannot give me an appropriate answer, then I actually think that we're getting into bed with the wrong people. Because education is no longer going to be about land and building. A lot of chalk and talk is already online. The core of it is going to remain the social engagement. So you cannot remain online as well. You cannot have teaching models which say that you can learn everything that you have in a classroom just doing it on the internet. So where will this blended learning come from and how do you create an environment? Classrooms are changing. You go to the young universities today, they're no longer sitting in the traditional benches in the classroom fashion. They've created clusters. Students are allowed to engage with each other during classes. They talk to each other. They've got, they're bandwidth crazy and hungry. And so they've given them all the tools. So that's what we need to be gearing ourselves with. And
preparing the companies for in the future. Phuti, Rakesh touching on succession and embracing young leadership.
Yes.
Let's get your thoughts.
Well, I think if you look in the last few years, we've been talking, around this issue. At the end of the day, I guess corporations have got their cultures. And the issue becomes, how do you then make sure that we see this type of change? The only way I can really see change happening has got to be through the creation of new businesses, through entrepreneurship, and young people being able to start businesses of their own. Because in an economy like South Africa, we have the space to be able to have new businesses being created. And so it's really about being able to create, the capital to be available to young people so that these businesses can be started. You've got young people, I'm involved with the Shanduka Black Umbrellas, which is an entity that is focused on creating entrepreneurship opportunities for people around the country. And the interesting thing is that you see people coming from corporate and starting their own businesses.
Let me be a little bit more specific.
Yeah.
What about the succession at Shanduka itself?
Yeah.
Given that you have now moved
Yeah.
and created
Yeah.
Sigma Capital in that entrepreneurial space that you're
Sure.
referring to.
Sure.
Did you identify your successor and work with the successor at Shanduka?
Yeah, no, well, what we did was we ended Shanduka. So, so there was
There we
not,
go. That's
so I was the last
pretty much
CEO.
that conversation. I should have done a little bit
Yeah.
of research on Shanduka, I think, at this stage.
The point is, Phuti, the two
Yeah.
of us met
Yeah,
many years
yes,
ago.
yeah,
And I'll tell you the story because, in those days was the start of the issues around how do you deal with gender equality in the workplace. And Phuti came to talk about leadership qualities and the contribution of women in the workplace. In a very
How
male,
many years ago was this?
we won't give away our ages. We both look very young. She looks absolutely spectacular, so to protect her, I won't say. But I want to tell you a story. I want to build on what Rakesh is saying. I want to tell a story about how lions hunt. And you all know it. And I've heard it very early in my career in the late 80s. A game ranger came to talk to us, and I was in Cape Town at the nuclear station. All the game is up here. So we knew nothing about it. And he's talking about how lions hunt. The lionesses would, in a pack, would look at, in a pride, would look at what they're hunting and decide who's going to take the lead. So if it's a limping buffalo, if it's a big animal, the strongest would go. If it's something that's very fast, the fastest would go. And so the trick of leadership is who must lead in different situations. So the story about Sid taking leadership in a certain area is about something that's crucially important. I'm not the best person to lead. There's somebody else. And therefore you have to understand that quite clearly as leadership. And the same with gender. And in some cases, you're not the best person to deal with certain issues. You need somebody else to deal with it. And that is part, and for me, the issue of succession then goes about, it's not just you as a leader, it's about how do you create a leadership, it's about how that is sustainable, beyond you. And how do you make sure that that environment I spoke about, the soccer thing, exists throughout your company. And so you have to invest in a couple of things. Firstly, make sure the vision is clear. Make sure, I used to tell my leaders exactly what leadership behaviors I expect. It was written down, it was a few, you all had to demonstrate that.
How many elements are there in that?
There were
Could you share with
four
us? Let's
specific
share those
elements.
four
And it's
specific
about
elements.
leaders has to make sure people live the vision. Leaders have to motivate people and unlock their potential. Leaders have to make sure that they set the targets clear. Leaders have to make sure they listen to people and they develop people. There's a few very core things. And the way I assess leaders was not against their performance contract, but against those behaviors. And I had 3 rankings. And it was always very clear. You're either in the top, and that's the top 10% of the leaders, the middle, or the bottom. If you're in the bottom, you should leave, or we as leaders should invest in those people leaving. If you're in the top, that you're high flyers. If you're middle, can you move some of the middle into the top? And that was it. It was very clear, it was very simple, but everybody knew that. And it's about not how do I assess it, but how do I see the department performance, how do I see the people. So I used to watch people, so if I look at people, and I look at the eyes, if they have a cap on, I would tell you exactly, so he's more engaged than that young man, just by the way they sit. Now, it is crucially important. It is honest.
But Brian, I want to understand, Phuti, is this what he was discussing with you many years ago? He was
Yeah. No,
putting forward demonstrating the leadership aspects, or the
No, I
in the
had been asked at his previous employer.
Brian, you started this conversation. I mean,
Yeah,
left the audience hanging.
Yeah,
Where
no, I had been
going.
asked to come and address this conference that was being held with all the women in the organization. And the CEO was there as well, which is something that was actually, unfortunately, unusual. Many times you'd find that you are asked and invited to come and speak on women issues in organizations, and the leader of the organization would not be there. And so this was, it was a wonderful surprise to see the CEO there at the event.
Thank you for giving us a little more context to
Yeah.
the story. At this point, we are nearly out of time, so let's just go to any further questions from the audience. And Mr. Granger, Professor Granger.
Perhaps we could start with the gender issue and then lead on to other aspects.
John, I did say we were running out of time. Do you want to choose one of those two aspects to bring to the fore?
The support that you rely on is very different to the support President Buhari relies on. How does your support group, how important is your support group to you? Your family, your friends? President Buhari had very distinct views from an emerging nation.
Well, I think his may not be the example that I want to comment on, but I think support groups are core to any leader. Family in itself is, I think, one of the greatest aspects of it. And if I look back at my life, if it hadn't been for the support that I got from my wife through the last 31 years that we've been married, there's no way I'd have achieved what I have. You have to define roles and responsibilities as you do in a corporate. You need to also define roles and responsibilities in a family. On the lighter side of it, we always joke at home that even the private bankers don't know if I exist because I've never actually gone to a bank. So my wife was able to take away all those hardships or day-to-day chores that you normally have to deal with if you're living a normal life. The life I chose as an entrepreneur and the businesses we've built in 22 countries requires me to be very mobile and not be there at home. And so she fulfilled a lot of these areas that I needed. So her support was integral to it, and I'm sure that most business people have similar support coming from their families. So it leads to a question: is there a balance in life? And how do you find a balance? And I feel that in the life of an entrepreneur, this balance is very difficult. Though at some stage in life you start wanting to relax a bit and get a certain amount of quality back, but I haven't been able to achieve that. It's perhaps a failing in me. Looking at the support within a business, and I also wanted to address the issue of succession. I think core to every leader is the fact that over time, you are going to get phased out, whether it's through age, whether it's through your contribution towards the business, and you need to recognize it. Smart leaders are the ones who actually are able to create that second tier of leadership as they progress. And they're able to actually help people to grow. Because if somebody sees that there's no room at the top, they're going to leave you. And the same thing happens for those leaders as they are part of your structure. If they are not able to demonstrate a career path to the people below them are going to leave. So you're going to end up losing good people for the wrong reasons. And it's because you're not being able to factor the growth of your organization and how you're going to allow people to grow with you. So first and foremost, and it goes back to one of the points Brian made, is first understand yourself well. Try and understand where you want to be and how you want to get there. And then make sure you create all these structures and support systems around it and make sure that people grow with you to achieve all these goals that you have. And your family goals are no different than your business goals. They're all integrated.
We've got a couple more questions. Quentin.
Mr. Wahi, in your book, you talk about your many adventures in life and like traveling to Russia, coming to Africa. but you also took a group of executives on a team-building expedition up to the summit of Kilimanjaro. So my question is, as a leader, if you can reflect on why or what makes you take certain risks.
I guess, let me talk about it in the two aspects that you raised. One is, inherent qualities of taking risk, and the second is, about the activities around it. And I'll deal with the second one first, because it's my great belief that you will never really come to know the true worth of people unless you put them into certain difficult circumstances. The grit of leaders typically comes out during times of crisis. And if I remember what happened when we went up Kilimanjaro, there were 15 different people who set out on this mission, different ethnicity, gender, and we came back as a family. The objective was very clear. 100% of our team will make it to the top. It's not about how quick, but the goal was we will all make it to the top. And we all did it. The guides who took us up basically said that over the 100 groups that they had taken over the last 10 or 12 years, we were just the 10th group that actually made it to the top, which was very important. Now that is an aspect of leadership that I use to test the people that are with me and to see who comes out on top in terms of how they behave under different and difficult circumstances. Then it's about risk-taking. And I think that is not about leadership, that's about entrepreneurship. Leadership can take, different shapes and forms in developed markets in different circumstances. An entrepreneur is something totally different. That is an inherent ability to take risk, where you're all in. You have a dream. So for me, the first thing for any entrepreneur is that you should have the ability to sit down and think beyond what somebody else is seeing. Why do I go to these countries? And, I was in Côte d'Ivoire just 2 days ago. And it drives me. I want to look for new things, new opportunities. And you have this obsession to create value in different parts of the world. When we went into Sri Lanka, there was a war going on. And even Microsoft, our partners there, turned around and said, there's a war here. Are you guys crazy? They were covering Sri Lanka from India. And I said, don't worry, as long as you give us the brand.
Rakesh, maybe I could just bring also Brian and Phuti back into the conversation. This level of risk-taking that Rakesh is putting on the table. You've obviously got to have a certain stomach for it. Phuti, you're very much in the entrepreneurial space now. And Brian, I'm going to get you to weigh in as well. Phuti, your thoughts on the element of risk-taking and linking that to leadership?
Yeah, I think it's something that it's very, very important because anytime you look at great leaders in business, such as Rakesh Wahi, you know that there has been a significant amount of risk that they've had to have an appetite for. But also just in the way in which they've been able to manage the opportunities once they had them in order to make them lasting. Because many times you'll come across opportunities and it will only be just for that period of time unless you can make it last for the long term, and that's a challenge in itself. And so you do need to have that ability to take risk, but it does need to be calculated to an extent. It can't just be, just wild risk-taking. You do need to think about
that
things.
Sustainability element
Absolutely.
that you're talking
Absolutely.
about. African rainbow energy and power. You've been scouting the African landscape for opportunities.
And I'm most probably not the best person to.
Are you not a risk taker?
So I was trained as a nuclear scientist, so no.
The Trump administration may need a nuclear scientist that's not a risk taker.
No, but I think what Rakesh said is very valuable, because you do take a risk, but from a very informed basis through your own lived experiences. And that gives you a sense of gut feel, and so when you do that. But the other point that is raised, I've always defined leaders as the person, your ability to sketch a vision, what you want to do, what you want to create, and the ability to take people to a place that they would never go to themselves. And so the Kilimanjaro example is exactly that. But through his experiences from the army and being in India and being in the mountains, I guess, you build up those experiences. So he had an understanding and he had a vision. And the question is, now how would you take all of this lot, 10 people, to a place that they would not go to themselves? And that is really the crux of the leadership, together with a well-informed, your experiences build up the quality of the risk that you would take.
We are out of time, but I'm going to close with this question to each of you. Who has had the most impact on your leadership style? Should I dodge you? Because that looks as though you're not giving me any eye line there. Oh, there we go, you've got.
Oh, no, I can.
Brian.
I'm trying to figure out the audience of what I say. So many people, I would say my mother and the principal I had at school.
Phuti?
Definitely my parents, particularly my father, who was there longer. I also have someone called Dr. Latimer in the States. Yeah. And I have others, but those are the people who've had the significant impact.
Finally, Rakesh?
I guess there are four people. Parents who give you your foundation, who give you your identity in life. And the basis of anything I learned came from them. My father on leadership, my mother on spirituality. And I think that defines who you become. My first boss in the army, who was ruthless. And, one of the jokes I always have, he said, you fall sick the day you die. So there was no sick leave. And so I think, you just build up a very strong core. And then it was Rick Michaels, who was the chairman of Communications Equity Associates, and somebody who actually showed me how to be a true entrepreneur.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our esteemed panelists. Thank you for joining us on this discussion on leadership. We've covered a lot of ground. We've gone from the US to South Africa. We've covered the whole African continent. And then finally, we've honed in on leadership, good leadership, be it in business, government, and we did touch on household, Rakesh. Thank you very much for bringing us to that point. Thank you.